When I first encountered Slay the Princess, it was through YouTube thumbnails. I was seeing enough recommendations and it sparked my curiosity. The artwork was captivating, and upon discovering it was a visual novel, I had to try it out. I was already a fan of choose your own adventure type games, so being captivated was not difficult. Games like Telltale's The Walking Dead series and Doki Doki's Literature Club were personal favorites in the same or at least adjacent category. From the onset of the game until the cinematic end, Slay the Princess was an awe-inspiring level of creativity, writing, game design, voice acting, music, and much else on a larger conceptual scale. The game was a masterpiece, and I put it in a tier of its own comparatively to other previous titles I've mentioned. On a larger scale, it has brilliant, albeit somewhat covert, explorations into philosophy, morality, psychology, narratives, perspectives, and the infinite on a grand scale. I'll be focusing on some of these core concepts and tie them to my own experience and society at large. I'll expound upon ideas in Slay the Princess and how they relate to postmodernism, moral fragmentation, individualism, levels of consciousness, and how straying from the narrow, straight path can be cataclysmic for your life. When I played this game, I was in a very fractious phase of my life, psychologically anyway. I was struggling with, or questioning, long-held life beliefs, some that I wasn't even conscious of. I was extremely morally conflicted, and from that, would find myself arguing with various personalities, spirits, or gods, if that's how you want to conceptualize it, within my psyche. Some were ego-driven, some were purely irrational, some were hedonistic, and others were suicidally addled. Nonetheless, I was constantly in a state of internal conflict. Now, I could explain how this happened, but I'd rather explore why this happened, and why it can and does happen to anybody. For most of this essay, I'll analyze all the voices you come across in Chapter 2, and we'll be using two different models for analysis. The first being the Freudian model, and the second being the HOMAth model, or Ken Wilber generalized. Before we start, I'll give a brief summary of these models. The Freudian mental model. Sigmund Freud's model of the psyche is divided into three key components. 1. The id. The primal, unconscious part of the mind driven by pleasure and instinct. It seeks immediate gratification for desires like hunger, aggression, and lust. Think of it as your inner wild child, chaotic, impulsive, and selfish. Number 2, the ego, the rational, conscious mediator between the id and external reality. It helps you navigate the world by balancing desires with social norms. The ego is the problem solver, making practical decisions to satisfy the id without causing chaos. And number 3, the superego, the internalized moral compass shaped by societal values and upbringing. It's your inner judge pushing for perfection and making you feel guilt when you fall short. These forces are constantly in conflict, shaping thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. The ego's job is to keep the peace between the wild id and the demanding superego, maintaining psychological balance. The HOMAth model. The HOMAth consciousness model is a simplified and generalized adaptation of Ken Wilber's complex developmental framework. While Wilber's All Quadrants, All Levels module focuses on integrating multiple dimensions of human experience, individual, cultural, social, and systemic, HOMAth condenses these ideas into 9 accessible, progressive stages of human development. These stages are: Level 1, Survive. Instinct-driven, focused on basic needs and immediate survival. Level 2, Connect. Awareness of relationships and the need for social bonding. Level 3, Control. Developing power dynamics and enforcing rules for stability. Level 4, Belong. Identifying with community values and collective identity. Level 5, Achieve. Rational thinking, goal setting, and competitive achievement. Level 6, Understand. Open-mindedness, embracing complexity, and seeking meaning. Level 7, Harmonize. Inner and outer balance, valuing interconnectedness. Level 8, Sanctify. Transpersonal thinking, deep empathy, and spiritual awareness. Level 9, Complete. Unity, consciousness, transcending ego, and division. And with that, let's begin analyzing the voices. I will use the princesses that are first encountered in Chapter 2 as the representatives for the voices, as I believe it makes the presentation slightly more palatable. Also, the chibis are kind of cute. You'll be introduced to this voice if you, without hesitation or contemplation, slay the princess, leading to the route of the specter. From his initial dialogue, he seems emotionless and detached from both the hero's and the narrator's perspective, though the cold did have a slight degree of resentment for the narrator, due to being tricked. Regarding his task, preordained by the narrator, he is indifferent and believes the princess is still dead, so there's no point in embarking down the path again. The cold has a very nihilistic mental framework, and from that nihilism lies a complete certainty in his thought processes. He is unmoved, unwavering from external stimuli, even when his claims are proven at least partially wrong. For example, when the princess is actually alive, as a ghost anyway, his egotistical intellectual certainty still captures him. His detached, overly rational commentary alienates the hero and leaves no room for emotionality. This is why I largely believe the voice of the cold is a good representation of ego in the psyche. His pragmatic, unemotional decision-making mediates the impulsive id and morally authoritarian superego. This also coincides with my conclusions that the cold resides within level 5 of the HOMAth levels of consciousness framework, or the generalized/simplified remix of Ken Wilber's school of thought. The cold's reliance upon rationality, cold hard facts, and similar showcases a higher degree of thinking than the more impulsive, reactionary lower tiers, but is still fragmented comparatively to level 6 and higher. You could say that this voice is what happens to somebody possessed by the skeptic and goes down a path of universal skepticism, a path of pure existentialism. This type of inner voice inevitably leads to nihilism and the pathologizing of intellect. This voice will be a consequence of having an amicable discourse with the princess, but eventually deciding to go upstairs to retrieve the pristine blade, and subsequently attempting to slay her, which you fail, leaving you fearful and defeated. Once you're killed, you're set onto the beast route, which is where the voice makes his appearance. The voice of the hunted is rather self-explanatory, or one-dimensional. He prioritizes survival above all else and represents a flight or flight response. There is an emphasis on the environment, his senses, and staying alert in his dialogue. Although this sort of voice, if you want to call it that, it's more of an innate instinct, is essential, there can still be ways in which these instincts can pathologize or leave you at a consistently low level of consciousness. To be consumed by fear, you risk all the advantages of higher level thinking that makes humans, well, humans. There can't be community, reciprocal relationships, law and order, government, morality, creativity, or even the ability to relax. Again, this instinct serves its purposes, as without it, humans probably wouldn't have made it this far in the natural world. But nonetheless, fear, doubt, or a struggle for survival should be a short-term mode of being, not something that consumes you. For example,
so scary they can say. It's okay, it's alright.
This voice is a solid representation of the id, and through the HOMAth conscious schema represents the lowest level of consciousness. Again, this voice has its purposes, but once isolated and left to control you, robs you of all the great things that makes humans civil, moral, cooperative, and altruistic. You're not much different from our ape cousins when left, or forced, to be at this level. Sometimes there's no choice, but if somebody is stuck at this level, there's either something seriously wrong with the environment, or there could be something to say about the individual in question and the actions that leave them here. The stubborn. The stubborn emerges when the player has an initial conversation with the princess, but eventually decides to slay her anyway. This gives her enough time to fight back, and from there, you both end each other's life. After that, you'll be set onto the route of the adversary. Upon meeting the stubborn, you'll notice this voice channels a fiery, bloodthirsty determination to push forward, regardless of consequences. It views the princess as an adversary whose destruction is non-negotiable, driven by unyielding willpower and defiance of external control. The stubborn thrives on competition, relishing conflict to validate its strength. The stubborn illustrates a slight subversion from the hunted, but also has its pathological underpinnings, or its narrow psychology. This voice is representative of a fight response, but with a tinge of prideful, egotistical striving for victory. While it represents an essential survival mechanism, one that fuels perseverance, it also leads to tunnel vision and a disregard for nuance. This voice resides at the intersection of the id, impulsivity, and ego, assertiveness, but its unbalanced nature skews towards the reactive side of the spectrum, representing levels 1 through 3 in HOMAF's framework. The narrow-sided eco-striving puts the stubborn primarily within level 3, but has shades of the lower 2 for the more id-incentivized survival mechanisms, for example, the fight response. The Opportunist. Getting the voice of the Opportunist can be achieved by gaining the princess's trust, but deciding to betray her on your way out of the basement, or by going upstairs to retrieve the blade and having the princess lock you in the basement. This puts you on the route of the witch. You notice right away that the Opportunist is possibly the most self-serving voice, or the most Machiavellian voice. He is constantly suggesting any action that will put the player and him in the most beneficial position. He will also flip-flop on actions depending on what he deems will benefit the player or himself. The Opportunist, like the cheated, is pragmatic but does not have an underlying wounded ego underneath. He signifies a quintessential con artist, purely focused on meeting his ends and has no qualms with breaking standard moral conventions. This voice lives in the ego, constantly calculating its moves to maintain an upper hand. Though affected in some short-term scenarios, its pathologies are similar to that of a selfish 4-year-old. Again, this is another voice that has a narrow, self-serving mental schema, and from that, alienates anything approximating reciprocal relations, anything with law, order, and the collective. It represents HOMAF's level 3 of consciousness, focused on self-protection and personal advancement. Left unchecked, the Opportunist leads to isolation and ASAPD adjacent tendencies. The Skeptic. The Skeptic emerges when the player decides to enter the basement with the blade in hand, but drops it and attempts to leave with the princess. The narrator will hijack this attempt, leading to the princess to slay you, as she recognizes you're trying to resist the influence of the narrator, and then you'll be set onto the route of the prisoner. In your initial meeting with the Skeptic, you'll notice he is constantly analyzing everything and everybody, and doesn't have any ounce of trust for the narrator or the princess. This skepticism doesn't seem to lessen to any degree, whether right or wrong, marking its pathological nature. This voice is amongst a few of the somewhat higher level conscious states, or the less impulsive states, but is hindered by, yet again, its narrow tunnel vision leading to disunity and fragmentation within the psyche. While seeing the world through pragmatic lenses and being curious is a good habit, insofar as it's part of a whole, functional psyche, being consumed by it will leave you in a state of analysis paralysis. It will leave you overthinking everything, even things that aren't that complex, abstract, or otherwise. Skepticism is a step above short-term hedonistic emotional whims or instincts, but lacks the openness required for healthy maintenance of your psyche, relationships, and community at large. Ultimately, having this sort of voice letting it take control, so to speak, indicates a need to be right, a need to satisfy your ego. Thus, the Skeptic is a clearer representation of an egotistical-centered voice. Within the HOMAF schema of level 5, this voice can achieve a lot due to its pragmatic, empirical, discerning eye, but is subdued to that level due to an inability to accept outside perspectives or circumstances within the realm of subjectivity, chaos, and the general liberalism, for lack of a better word, of level 6 and higher. The Cheated. Going down the path where you bring out the voice of the cheated, the player must slay the princess right away, but has doubts about her demise, which leads to her killing you. Thus you are cheated out of victory. This sets you onto the route of the Razor. Once meeting the cheated, you'll notice he is quite passive-aggressive and distrustful. He harbors petty resentment towards both the narrator and the princess. He wants to slay the princess purely for his petty desire for vengeance, not because he cares about the narrator's wishes. This voice represents a fractured ego consumed by the desire for vengeance and justice. The cheated operates from a place of control, reflecting level 3 of consciousness. Operating at this level is common for people of dark tetrad personalities, for example, people of narcissistic, psychopathic, and Machiavellian tendencies. The Broken. Similar to the voice of the cheated, you have an initial conversation with the princess, decide to slay her, fight with her a bit, and give up midway. From there, the princess takes a superior angle, leaving you broken and then subsequently killing you. You are led to the route of the Tower. From here, you'll meet the voice of the Broken. The broken is the most depressed, hopeless, and pitiful voice out of the bunch, consistently commenting on how it's all hopeless, how it's pointless to try to stop the princess. In fact, he's so fervent in that belief, submission is the only thing he advocates for the player. The broken is a clear representation of depression, hopelessness, and helplessness. He's the most pessimistic voice. The reactionary and emotional immediacy implies id possession. His submission and withdrawal showcase a freeze or fawn response, which are deeply unconscious defense mechanisms. Though the broken can recognize the danger or threats within his path, he showcases an impulsive defeatist response, foregoing any agency that would align with higher levels of consciousness. From these observations, level 2 seems the most precise placement for this voice. He's just barely outside the first level, but only employing an impulsive prevention strategy that makes survival in a bad state manageable. The paranoid. To be greeted with the voice of the paranoid, the player must lock the princess in the basement, leading to the princess becoming nightmarish in an attempt to escape. The player's fear of her eventually causes him to die, and then you're sent onto the nightmare route. The paranoid's initial dialogue showcases a deep and profound fear of the princess. Every comment, action, or thought is contextualized through a terrified narrative for the paranoid. Even though the paranoid shares a fear akin to the hunted, there is a distinct difference separating the conscious levels being operated and the placement within the Freudian model. Juxtaposed to the hunted, the paranoid's fear is far more cognitive, conceptual, and imaginative. The paranoid's fear is not as direct and instinctual. This places him within a superego representation. The self-regulated and judgmental behavior indicates as such. Then the need to control every aspect of the environment showcases a pathologizing towards OCD or avoidant tendencies, anxious or potentially even schizophrenic tendencies on the far end of the spectrum. This observation squarely puts him into level 3 consciousness, control. Once again, this low-level, impulsive, and narrow-minded mental possession alienates a fuller relationship with your psyche and subsequently your relationships, community, and society at large. You're high up enough on the consciousness spectrum to be able to think ahead, but only through the paradigm of fear and self-preservation, making your level only minimally advanced compared to the lower survival levels. These fearful tendencies have their place, but if left disintegrated or unregulated, you risk isolating yourself and spiraling into a hellish entropic existence. The player will meet the voice of the Contrarian if he decides to reject the narrator's quest and walk into the opposite direction of the cabin. The world eventually implodes, leading to the route of the stranger. Upon meeting the Contrarian, you'll notice he has a streak for mischief and rebellion about him. Actively trying to irritate the narrator, he delights at any opportunity to throw contrasting suggestions to the player, to downplay the narrator's main objective. His only motive seemed to be for the sake of satiating his curiosity and avoiding boredom. The Contrarian has a proclivity for creativity and exploration, which signifies a somewhat healthy/steady mental state, elevated above the more survival-based id levels of consciousness. The issue lies in, yet again, taking a mental state and pushing it to its extreme limit. Being able to be creative and exploring without fear of imminent death is very useful, but by itself it can lead to entropy, analysis paralysis, and chaos, pushing you back to the lower levels of consciousness. It is pathological and self-destructive in its extreme form. This voice, this spirit, if you will, conveys a sort of criticism of norms that somebody like the hero would uphold. Though this independent/individualist thinking might seem reminiscent of level 6, it stays within the level 5 paradigm due to being an ego-possessed assertion of rationality, because its focus is more on breaking away from norms to assert individual rationality, not fostering inclusivity or collective growth. It critiques from a position of skepticism and self-reliance, not rational integration. The Smitten. The Smitten comes about through complete pacifism and resisting the narrator's attempts to slay the princess. The princess, in her soft form, juxtaposed to the cold version of her if you take the pristine blade, sees your attempt to control yourself, takes pity on you, and clumsily kills you as she repeatedly says sorry, teary-eyed and sorrowful. After your lovely demise, you'll be set on the route of the damsel, which is where you'll meet the Smitten. The Smitten is bold about his love for the princess and is solely focused on saving her and fantasizing about a long romantic life with her. His infatuation with her is obsessive and one-dimensional. Any comments, suggestions, or dialogue coming from the narrator and or the hero, the Smitten contextualizes to make the princess seem like a perfect goddess, unable to commit evil or have a capacity for any wrongdoings. This voice is quite evidently a representation of obsessive, infatuating, and delusional love, a representation of what happens when you pathologize honeymoon phase feelings. The id has a strong implication in this, as the sexual drive for reproduction is why these sorts of feelings can be and are as potent as they are. Taken to its extreme, it causes delusions and an almost idealistic idolatry of one's love interest. Level 2 seems the most likely level, as the instinctual/sexual nature of this voice is quite apparent. The simplistic pursuit of pleasure is a strong driver at this level. The danger of this level, this infatuation, is the possibility of delusion and idealism that doesn't match reality, that doesn't match with the more realistic and pragmatic problems that may arise in relationships, especially romantic ones. People possessed by this sort of spirit tend to be serial daters or are incapable of long-term commitment, as they are in love with the ideal more than the actual person. These strong feelings have their place, they have their reproductive utility, but without integration with the other levels of consciousness, the unity of desire between the ego and the superego, you are doomed to short-term animalistic attributes within yourself and by extension, short-term and temporary relationships with the external world. The hero. The hero is the quintessential archetype of, well, the hero. Diplomatic and traditional, he tries to find ways in which he can find the most harmonious solution for everybody involved. He wants to, unsurprisingly, be the hero who saves everybody. The reason he is there from the beginning and is constantly present regardless of what pathological voice might be warring within him is that he is the conscious cognitive framing, always within the grasp of perceiving, within the grasp of being seen. In the Freudian sense, the hero is representative of the conscious mind. He is present from the beginning because he showcases the perceptible conscious thought, the hybrid of ego and superego. He is in constant struggle, in constant internal warring with all these various voices, spirits, and unconscious entities. He is the idealistic, morally judgmental father, trying to regulate all the egotistical, impulsive, and unconscious, then made conscious, urges that emerge during the various routes you can take. Within him lies the multitude of spirits that can potentially manifest, made conscious, through chapters 2 and 3 in the loops. In regards to his consciousness level, purely based on his dialogue and personality, he is aligned with level 5, Achieve. Most hero figures find themselves at this level because they are embedded in a linear story, psychologically speaking anyway, which alienates postmodern ideas of accepting communal relativism, pluralism, and individualistic perception, which will lead to the characters and stories becoming too complex for the narrative. These are the foundations of level 6 thinking, something the game as a whole is nested in, questioning/playing with narratives and meta-narratives. The path with the least amount of complexity and entropy is what the hero is supposed to be doing, which is what the narrator advocates for. The game is questioning the idea of supposing to do anything, leaving it all to a matter of perspective and different paths with their own merits and moral values, which is where you, the player, come into play. What kind of person would enjoy this kind of game? How has meta become the new meta in media? For example, media such as Doki Doki Literature Club, Undertale, Me-Side, The Stanley Parable, Deadpool, Inception, and others share this in common. Meta-narratives, grand narratives, and non-linear storytelling. Again, who likes these kind of games? Well, I don't know about all of you, but I can generalize based on why I like it, and just presumptively assume most of you are the same. I enjoy meta stories because they're open-ended and they're open to interpretation, and being open gives creative types a whole world to dissect and investigate. Seeing all the layers, perspectives, and ambiguous messages of the story, that's where creativity thrives. It also could be purely out of rebellion toward the ideals of the traditional stories. People such as myself enjoy these types of stories because we can take away from the story whatever satisfies our perspective on it, our worldview on it. We find linear storytelling too dull, rigid, traditional, and morally posturing, like your boomer father who doesn't understand your weird little eccentric hobbies.
Work hard, don't do drugs, and find a wife, son.
Stuff like that, just in media form. Anyway, as funny as it is to make fun of your boomer dad or grandpa, There's a bit of truth in what they have to say in regards to life, which is what I'll be talking about for the closure of this essay. Now, I do enjoy this genre of media, but there is a major problem I find within its undercurrent: postmodernism. At least postmodernism without any constraints. Although questioning narratives is fine in principle, there remains an insidious, sort of unconscious mind bug that gets implanted into people who take critiquing narratives to its final conclusion: that there is no true narrative, only perspectives, only relativism. This brings me to finally announce the player's level of consciousness, which is level 6, individualist/pluralist. Now, within its constraints, this is fine. Postmodern ideas in media are great, and that's what creatives are supposed to be doing. They explore the fringe. They break boundaries that conservative traditionalists, levels 4 through 5s, are rooted in. But when does it go too far? Can it go too far? From my personal experience, yes it can. Without knowing it, I've been an ideologue for postmodern thought for several years. But why is that a problem? Well, it became a problem because I didn't believe in anything concrete at least, foundational or solid otherwise. I believed that everything was subject to perspective, that everything was morally gray. Just like in the game, I had multiple voices from varying sectors of my psyche warring over what they wanted, who was right, and whether it was right or wrong. My morality became as fluid as my urges, ungrounded and without foundation. I've potentially lost a number of you at this point, but I just want to reiterate, I'm not condemning these games or even the notion of questioning narratives themselves, because I love this kind of genre. But I believe for certain individuals and society at large, you can't employ or force level 6 thinking. There needs to be a balance and integration of the lower levels. The popularity of this genre speaks to the compelling ideas that inevitably and already have permeated into the culture. Pluralism has its place, but it needs to be integrated within a framework that is accepting of the lower tiers. That's how you ascend above level 6, reaching harmony, and so on. Even on a personal psychological level, if you're not capable of moral integrity, of being the Ubermensch, creating your own values and sticking by them, you'll end up exactly like the player in Slay the Princess, except you don't get a redo. Maybe you are capable of that, then kudos to you, but it's a hard ask. If you try to navigate the world exploring all the multiplicities, can you reach your destination without faltering? Can you handle the entropy? How will you ward off all the competing spiritual motivations within you? Can you have a psychological consensus in your mind that's also in consensus with the external world? How can you be so sure your intellectual conclusions are worth their salt if everything is relativistic? Are you sure that you're not using entropy as an excuse to avoid the responsibilities of the surely successful narrow path? That you're not being guided by a spirit that wishes to take you, that wishes to consume you in its short-term whim-based impulsivity? That you're not using complexity as an excuse for your moral flip-flopping? These are all questions I've wrestled with, as I'm the very type of person that I'm criticizing. I understand the point of the game is to explore the multiplicities, but I'm speaking more so to the underlying narrative criticism that has been rather popular in media for a while now. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that relativism has its place, but psychologically and societally, you need to have unification. You need to have all your motivations aimed toward the same thing, or you risk being overtaken by the entropic chaos that multiplicity inevitably brings. There needs to be a balance between creative liberal and traditionalist thinkers. There needs to be a balance between order and chaos, as Jordan Peterson would say. Admittedly, kind of one of my bigger inspirations for this sort of content. Anyway, it's fun and thought-provoking to explore these meta-narratives. It's fun to deconstruct linear narratives, but don't they still have their merit? Traditional stories of heroes, dragons, pirates, romance, honor, and adventure. There's a reason these kinds of stories have persisted for as long as humans were able to create stories. What I'm trying to say is you can't hide away in ambiguity forever. That isn't to say that everything should become binary, but everything shouldn't be valid either. It can't all be valid. If everything is valid, then nothing would matter. It becomes a sort of communist value structure, and we know historically what communism leads to. Although there are many options, routes, and things to explore in life, sometimes you just need to slay the princess.